Welcome to the Glucose Never Lies podcast. I'm John Pemberton, a diabetes educator and researcher living with type 1 diabetes since 2008. I started the Glucose Never Lies website when my son tested positive for type 1 diabetes antibodies. In that moment, I realised I needed to build a resource strong enough to guide anyone who might care for him, and something I wish I'd had when I was first diagnosed. At first, that meant writing clear, actionable management guides, but listening to Peter Attia's The Drive taught me something. The written word often misses important details and context. Peter's conversations provide depth across nutrition, exercise, pharmacology, sleep, and much more. But I always find myself wondering, how does this information apply to people with type 1 diabetes? And this podcast is my attempt to fill that gap. Through my work as a specialist diabetes dietitian, I develop international guidelines, serve on global committees, publish in peer-reviewed journals, and present at international conferences. Therefore, I have access to the world's leading researchers and thought leaders in type 1 diabetes. That gives me a unique opportunity to combine lived experience, professional expertise, and cutting-edge science, and to share it all on here in conversation. That's why on this show you'll find the latest scientific evidence translated into practical steps, honest conversations on getting the most out of diabetes technology, insights on balancing nutrition, exercise, and sleep while living a full life, lived experiences on how to party, play sports, and much more, all in the context of type 1 diabetes. But an important note, this podcast is for informational purposes only. These conversations share knowledge and experiences. They do not create a therapeutic relationship. So, let's get started. Welcome to the Glucose Never Lies episode 18 with none other than Professor Othmar Moser. And so I'm going to introduce Othmar in a second, but first of all, obviously with the Glucose Never Lies, what we're trying to do is bring in guests who have professional experience, personal experience, but most importantly can bring in real-life actionable insights. So, Professor Othmar Moser, if I'm right in saying Professor of Exercise Physiology, leader of guidelines on CGM AID, and also a person living with type 1. Is that a fair start?
I think that's me, yeah. I think that's a good start.
And I guess how I got to know you was you were actually the first recipient of my crazy email at 6 a.m. I'd read the original CGM guidelines back in 2020, I think it was. And there were all these algorithms in there of how to suggest an amount of carbohydrate based on all these different variables, which was amazing. I thought, how are we going to build this into practice? And I just got into doing a bit of coding on PDF. So I developed this calculator and basically sent it to you with this massive email saying, what do you think? And I can only imagine receiving that. It must have been like, who is this bloke?
I think my first impression was it's a quite long email. So this is why I'm always struggling with when the emails are too long. But, then I checked the details. And as you know, you're receiving a whole lot of these emails. And I did see, okay, the content is really good. And I think this is how and why we came together from a research point of view. I think I learned enough from you. It's not like that I'm a leader of anything. So it's always a nice group of people setting a position paper up for CGM, for AID, and this is how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I'm incredibly grateful because I got a chance to work with you on our small section in the 2022 ISPAD guidelines. Then you very kindly invited me to be part of the AID guidelines. And I've obviously learned a lot. And for me, that's the important point of having this conversation is all those conversations that happen behind the consensus guidelines nobody sees. And to be behind the scenes to that and see that not everyone agrees, everyone has their own little ideas. And what ends up in the guideline is kind of like, it's correct and it's the most robust and safe, or not necessarily what everyone completely believes in certain ways that they do their practice. So I think for me, I really enjoyed those conversations. And I also thought, well, what an opportunity to go a little bit deeper and discuss some other things further. So hopefully people watching with type 1 and also healthcare professionals can understand a bit more about what goes into making those decisions, but also some of the clinical nuggets that can help them in practice.
So first of all, I needed to learn that it's not my opinion or my data that are solely within such a position paper. As you were correctly saying, it's always a huge discussion on each point, on each sentence within a position paper.
Is that why there was 4-hour meetings?
Yeah, but these were the short meetings, to be honest. So we had next to the big meetings with all of the team members, we had separate meetings. So this is why it took 1.5 years in total. So this is the explanation for it. But This position paper is generally based on evidence. So mainly based on evidence, you need to show an evidence level. So did the study exactly show what you are recommending? And then for sure, which was a major problem with our position paper, we did discuss in detail commercially available devices. So we are so close to the companies, which can be good and great, but at the same time, it's difficult that it's balanced. But for us, at the end of the day, it was like setting something up that helps people living with type 1 diabetes. So using an insulin pump, I just check this is my problem around exercise, and this might be a solution. And it should be the same for HCP supporting people with type 1. They just need to ask, this device is this person using, what is your problem? And then there might be a solution within this position paper. So it's really practical. And this is why we developed it.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, because I think the guidelines from, remember reading back in the 2018 ISPAD guidelines, I remember reading it, there's a lot of text, a lot of recommendations, but very little that you could just pull straight from it and use it. So in my opinion, a great guideline is, these are recommendations, this is the science now, this is how you put it into practice. And I think, congratulations to you and your wife, because I know she was involved massively in making the individual discs for each system, which really breaks down nicely. And I'll point the listeners into them. But essentially, you ask one question at the beginning: is it planned or is it unplanned? And then there's just a set of questions or options. And then from there, that's the top half of the circle. It's either one or the other. And then the bottom half of the circle, and there is a beautiful graphic in there, which I think is, in my opinion, the best exponent of what's likely happened to the glucose level, what should be happening to the insulin doses, and what should be happening to the carbohydrate requirements, and breaks it down according to what are you then expecting the glucose level to do in the activity. And therefore, on the second half, if you understand that, you then say, well, are you expecting to go high, stay stable, or go low? Yeah. And then there's a carbohydrate recommendation. So as a healthcare professional, you can literally go, question number 1, planned or unplanned, circle this. Are you expecting to go high or stay steady? Circle this. There's your plan to start with. But that is a beautiful thing to go from 35 hours worth of discussion to one disc. That's a journey that requires serious implementation.
Yeah, I think, the idea was from my wife to build it that way. She's an architect, so she has a better understanding of how to show things visually. So I was just fine that I had the information, that I had the evidence, and she had a bunch of ideas. And then we built this up, and I was just fortunate that the entire writing group did agree on it. For me, it was so important, as you were correctly saying, it must be practical. So it must be able to be used by a person living with type 1 diabetes. Most of our patients are taking a picture of these discs, have it on the mobile phone when they go out for a run, and they just check, what should I do now? And you can use it as a first recommendation. It must be personalized, individualized, followingly, but as a first recommendation, it's a perfect match, to be honest. We are using these discs already now for 2 years, even it was not published. The responses were quite well. So in comparison to 2020, when we did the CGM position paper, I received 80% positive emails and 20% were, this hate you emails. But within 2025, within the AID position paper, I did only receive one negative email of an MD. But I think he was a cardiologist and he has no understanding what AID means and what type 1 diabetes means.
And I think also I've got to give a lot of positivity to Mike Riddell and Desi as well. I can never pronounce Desi's last name. Is that Saharieva? Is that right?
Saharieva.
Okay, beautiful. She'll kill me for that. That was fine. But Desi obviously was lead author with you, joint lead author, and Mike was senior author, and obviously yourself as a team. I know you all personally, you've all got type 1. You really want to make sure people with type 1 and people supporting them have the best starting point. And I think that's the key thing to say is these position papers and offers for starting are our best guess. What on average will work for an individual. And then it's plan B or plan C. And I think that is sometimes needs to be explained to people with type 1 and also healthcare professionals, because if you're as a person receiving that information, you think this plan's going to work perfectly for me, then it doesn't. All of a sudden you can be disappointed. It does require some trial and error.
Exactly. So use it as a first recommendation. And even if it works for 3 months, it could be completely different in 4 months. So it's very important to understand we have developed this guidance as a first recommendation, and then it must be absolutely structured based on this person living with type 1 diabetes. When I think back with my diagnosis is now, I think 20 years ago, 22 years ago, there was nothing out there. Mike Riddell did some early studies at this stage.
Mhm.
There were a little bit of support because I did not understand, scientifically the content when you're aged 16, 17 years old. But now I think these days we have so much evidence. We have these new recommendations. And at the same time, to be honest, we just want to push that everyone with type 1 diabetes is doing exercise regularly, first of all, and secondly, that they are physically active. It's such a multipotent drug. Not too many people are using it. And we are discussing this device, that device. To be honest, my thought is I would prefer a person living with type 1 diabetes with a time in range of 70% doing everyday exercise instead of someone having a time in range of 100% and doing no exercise. So I do see this potency of exercise, and we must just ensure that people are able to do safe exercise.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I think one of the things where I work is
just need to check my sugar.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I'm running a little bit high. The excitement of speaking to you is we have where I work at Birmingham, and I'll actually put some of this in the show notes. Right from day one, the first conversation we have with people is we don't talk about carb counting or exercise. We talk about meal structure and activity in for 10 minutes after each meal to expedite the effectiveness of that insulin, but also to give the confidence of 10 minutes 3 times a day is achievable. It will reduce your insulin requirements and also get you on the path of safety that activity is a good thing. Yeah. And it's good for glucose control. And I think CGM is amazing for that, because before, if you're told something as a kid, you're going to be better when you're 60 if you do exercise, they're not interested. However, if they see this thing going off and it's beeping and all of a sudden they do 10 minutes of activity and it stays nice and steady, that immediate feedback now gives a tangible, oh, this is actually working. Make it a big difference.
That's true. And I think this is the opportunity also of CGM. So we have this real-time biofeedback system also in type 1 diabetes. And as you were explaining correctly, when people with type 1 diabetes, especially kids, do see my postprandial peak is lower when I'm just walking for 10 minutes afterwards. There's no need to do, I don't know, a run or whatever. Just walk for 10 minutes and the postprandial peak will be lower. And if you do it 3 times a day, it's 30 minutes. If you do it seven times a week, it's 210 minutes. So you're above the WHO recommendation of physical activity per week. But this is an easy way as you do in your clinics. And we try the same, that people understand this natural positive effects of being physically active. And it's hopefully getting better. I even do not see, for example, GLP-1 receptor agonists as a competitor. They are just working mainly on the body weight and some further regions within the body. But you have this overall drug that is working holistically within your body, and this is called exercise.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree. If it was a drug and it was available on prescription, everyone would be on. Everyone would be on it, a potent dose of it. And I think that's...
I need to interrupt you.
Sure.
I hope this never occurs. Yeah. I'm always afraid that we have... So from my point of view, it's already very close with GLP-1 receptor agonists that we have something similar like an exercise drug. And I'm afraid that in about 20 years, everyone is taking 1 pill a day and everyone is fully in shape like you are. So
hey, I'm on the special pills.
Yeah, no one knows. No, just kidding. Just kidding. No, but it should be active movement. And, we do also see people living with type 2 diabetes in our outpatient clinic. And we are discussing each time physical activity, exercise, nutrition, and additionally with a psychologist and a support team. However, people do so often prefer giving an injection a day instead of doing it actively. But we, have also this positive effect from the mind setting psychologically, we do see depression rates in type 1 diabetes and type 2. Every third person is at least on a depressive symptom situation. So come on, guys, do exercise. It's so important and makes fun. You come closer to friends if you do it in a group, or do it with the family or with your wife, your husband, whatever. It makes you happy.
Yeah.
It makes you feel better. And it's a multipotent drug without giving an injection.
I mean, I totally agree. I actually love that this conversation has started this way, because obviously people will have tuned in thinking, okay, we've got basically one of the best people in the world to talk about exercise and reducing the risk of hypos and optimal performance. But really, the key message for everyone with type 1 is general levels of activity are low risk of hypoglycemia. Positioning them in the best place possible is post-meal to get in control. And something that we've just accepted as a paper and I'm presenting here on Friday is when you're above 10 millimoles per litre or 100 milligrams per decilitre from the type 1 DEXI data, 20 minutes will drop the glucose level by 2 millimoles per litre or 40 milligrams per decilitre directionally, as long as you've had insulin and a meal within 4 hours. That's the caveat there. And obviously, if your ketones are high, don't do it.
Yeah.
But that again, how many times do people do this? They get high sugar, so I'll just put in one correction dose.
Yeah.
And then it's not working, and then another,
yeah,
and then another.
And maybe one sentence. Exercise is immediately working via the blood glucose lowering effect. Think about it. If you go for a fast-acting insulin, it takes 20 up to 40 minutes that you have the onset in the pharmacokinetic or pharmacodynamic profile. So exercise via, this glucose transporter type 4 is working immediately. This is why it's going down so fast. But the insulin takes much longer. And as you were correctly saying, if the ketones are low, so you have enough basal on board, then just go for a walk instead of going for 1 unit, another, or 2 units, which always ends up 2 hours afterwards in a hypo.
Exactly, 100%. So, and the beauty of it's kind of like immediately on and very quickly immediately off as well, whereas the insulin's slow on, long off.
For up to 6 hours.
So again, I think I love the way this has started. Being active is great for everything in terms of physical health, mental health. It's an absolute amazing glucose control tool, especially post-prandial, and even if you're high in the presence of some insulin.
Yeah.
And that alone in a day will get you 30 to 40 minutes. You'll get glucose control benefits, physical activity benefits, and obviously the health stuff. So if no one takes anything away from this conversation and they're currently only doing nothing, then just putting that post-prandial exercise will make a massive difference.
Absolutely.
And potentially reduce your overall insulin dose. We know higher circulating units per kilo is associated with cardiovascular disease. You get those units down, you're also protecting your cardiovascular health for the future as well. So lots of things to be said for activity and movement. So I tend to separate activity and movement is a glucose control health tool.
Yeah.
Exercise is an enjoyment, if you like it, thing, but does come with increased risk of hypoglycemia in the main. So it's nice to separate it like that. Activity and movement, time in range, health, exercise, amazing, but also hypoglycemia risk. And we need to think differently. So I think what would be super helpful if you're happy is we'll walk through either a healthcare professional or a person with diabetes. What questions should they ask themselves before the activity? And based on those questions, what could they consider for adjustments? And then in play, what could they do? And then after. So we'll start with the kind of before. As a person with and a person who supports people with, what sort of questions are coming in your mind are really good questions to ask to evaluate your hypoglycemia risk?
So in the clinic, the very first question I'd always ask, if you were allowed to only give me one problem you have around exercise, then say it now. And most of the people do say, okay, exercise-induced hypoglycemia. So what we are doing in preparation to exercise is always, first of all, do you know this type of exercise and what is your normal regular glucose response to this type of exercise? Most of the people do then say for moderate to low intensity exercise, they see a drop in glucose and they would like to avoid hypoglycemia. So in preparation, then we would normally suggest, ideally when they are running on an AID system, 2 hours in advance, start this so-called exercise mode. Let's call it exercise mode. It could be called temp target, ease of physical activity feature, whatever.
And that's a good question there, because I think this is a really good question. So this came up in the guidance, and actually what I listened to you speak at the CAM APS Excellence Exchange yesterday is the reality of individuals with type 1 putting that on 2 hours before is close to, in my clinic, And me personally, it's close to 0%, if I'm totally honest. Whereas with the CAN APS, I do have to give it, it really made me think yesterday, that plan D's off, where parents can set it for their young children in the morning, or an individual type 1 can set it as the day starts. It then takes out the equation. I do think that is a big thing, because obviously we want the exercise target on to reduce the insulin. But remembering, you still need to put it on even if you forget, because of all those other benefits. But it's just important to pick that out. If you're someone who's not particularly good at planning, that kind of system might offer some advantages.
So let's start with the kids. It's cool. It's a great feature that when you know your son has these exercise sessions in school at 11 a.m., you can pre-program it that at 9 a.m. the glucose target is getting increased, or ease off is studied, or whatever. So, if this person is 11-year-old or 7 years old, it's easy for the parents to support via home what will be done, whatever in school. So this is a good feature. I think the reality, as you were saying, that most of the adults don't start this exercise mode early enough is existing. From my point of view, it's getting better that most of the people are starting this exercise feature 1 hour in advance to exercise. I think this is the reality. Some people doing 30 minutes in advance, but we need to be clear, the earlier you starting this activity feature, the lower the risk of hypoglycemia is, due to one reason: insulin on board is lower. And we do know from the data from Mike Riddell that one of the main drivers for hypoglycemia is in general insulin on board. So the earlier you start this exercise feature within an AID system, the better it is. We must be clear on that.
So just so I'm summarizing from there, if you're on an AID system, the exercise mode, equivalently, if you're on a standard pump therapy, that's a 50% directionally basal reduction.
So I think the maximum recommendation is 80%, but the recommendation is 50 to 80%. And it should also follow the same timeline, ideally 2 hours in advance, decrease the basal delivery for exercise types where you're expecting a drop in glucose. Important to say that, because we have the complete opposite recommendation with an increase in glucose.
And then obviously if you're on MDI, you don't really have that luxury of a temporary reduction in insulin. So you'll either have to do, if you're on a split basal, which is unlikely, you could do a reduction in the morning, but you're then left with bolus reductions or carbs. So we talked about the background. What about preparations in terms of bolus insulin? What are you thinking in terms of questions and carbohydrate amounts?
So if you consume some carbohydrates with a big meal within this 2 hours gap in advance to exercise, we are recommending a prandial insulin dose reduction by around 25%. If you are at the onset of exercise and you see your glucose is not above the 7 millimol per liter, so 126 milligram per deciliter, then we are recommending fast-acting 10 up to 20 gram carbs that you immediately go up, that you can start exercise. So this is the structure for the prandial situation, what should be done with the glucose target based on the timing. And when you're at the onset of exercise, too low, go in with 10 up to 20 gram fast-acting carbs, but fill it into the system if the system has this opportunity as something like an hypoglycemia treatment. Why? Because otherwise the automated basal delivery is going off.
So for example, on the CAN APS, you put admiral hypoglycemia treatment, so it will just relax. And then for people on MDI, multiple day injections and pump therapy, is it a 25 or 50% reduction in the bolus generally as a starting point?
So my personal idea is not going higher in the reduction than 25%, because then we do often see with the 50% reduction that people are starting with 17 millimol per liter or whatever. So I would like to see that most of our patients are staying around exercise between a 7 and a 10 millimol per liter in the perfect world, but it's not so easy with type 1. But this is what we are aiming for. So it would be maybe saying with the traditional CSRI and MDI therapy, 25 up to 50% reduction.
It's only a starting point.
It's a starting point.
And I think actually 2 points that I think have really hit home for me, and we discussed a little bit in the ISPAD 2022 guidance. We've had loads of discussions. I know how for Desi and Mike as well. So this 2 hour window frame is basically there for safety. But if you want optimal or in target glucose control, you're better off doing either one or two things. Get your meal and insulin at least 3 hours before, so the vast majority of the insulin in the food is finished by the time of start. Or if you're going to eat within the 2 hours, get it close to the start, so within 30 to 60 minutes. So even if you do a 25 to 50% reduction, you're only going to rise to 10, 11, 12, or 180 to 220, not all the way up to 17. So try and have that in your time frame. Best control, most consistent results, get the meal and insulin 3 hours before. If you have to, especially children, eat close to, get it within 60 minutes if you can. Therefore, you don't end up spiking with the reductions.
I think this was the effect you were explaining at the very beginning, this post-prandial situation when you start to walk. You can do the same in the exercise virtually. If you go for a 50% reduction, 30 minutes in advance to exercise for the prandial insulin, those before the peak occurs, you start to move and you might stay stable, hopefully. However, at the same time, the general insulin on board is still high, even relatively high, even if it's a 50% reduction. But to be honest, if the hypo alert is at 100 milligram per deciliter, if you have this fast dropping alert activated, and if you're checking 10 or 15 minutely your CGM readings, even with you have this lag time around 12 minutes, you should be safe. And additionally, you always have the option of doing a confirmatory blood glucose measurements. We are still recommending this. So I always prefer saying, do 1 or 2 blood glucose measurements during exercise instead of feeling unsure during this session if my interstitial glucose is really showing the real blood glucose. But this is a huge discussion ongoing. I had a chat with Guido Freckmann about it, so he's very close to us. But to be honest, if you are deciding doing 3 blood glucose measurements during the exercise session, I'm supporting you. And if you're saying, I don't want to do any, I'm also fine. But if you have symptoms, you must do a blood glucose measurement.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I'm smiling is because this is the difference, I think, between guidelines and conversation. So the guidelines, for example, we'll discuss within 2 hours, but the nuance we've just discussed. And quite rightly, we've moved on to in-play exercise, which is check just before, maybe have supplementary carbohydrates if you're less than 7, certainly. And if you're between 7 and 10 anticipating to drop, then obviously have some supplementary carbs. But then what I really like to talk about, and I know we wrote a little commentary on this, is the CGM manufacturers would like to tell you, and they do tell you, that they have non-adjunctive therapy decision making, and they do, and they're accurate. But what they're not tested in is exercise conditions when you've got insulin on board and the glucose level is 2 hours down. Anyone with type 1 diabetes knows there can be a 10 millimole difference or an 8 millimole per difference at that point. And that is a real key point, which you're just saying is, number one, get your hypo alert higher. 5, 5.5, 100, 110. And if you've got double arrows down and you're getting less than 7, really think about getting the meter out, because there's a really good chance during exercise you're going to be lower. And obviously you can't necessarily put that in the guidelines because it then crosses sometimes what the CGM manufacturer's indications are. But anyone with type 1 or looking after type 1 who's done that test, start activity with insulin on board, really go for it, see the double arrows down, do the finger pick. It's like 7, 8, 9 different.
So we did a whole lot of studies on that. So during different types of exercise for different types of CGM. And I think, to be honest, they are extremely accurate when you do nothing. So when you do not eat, when you do not walk, and you're just laying in the bed your entire life.
Just think about my daily life now.
Absolutely. This is how I do. Then they are absolutely fine. But we are now working with the companies together to improve the algorithm and also to having something like an automatic exercise detection in their CGM readings, that they know that the drop might be faster than you would expect under non-exercise conditions. But at the end of the day, I think, you have some days already type 1 diabetes. I do have some days type 1 diabetes, and we had nothing at the beginning.
No.
I had 5 blood glucose strips a day. And when I wanted to have more, I needed to pay for it. And this was not accessible and not achievable for me as a student. So I think these discussions are very important to improve the quality of the technology and the therapy of type 1. But we must make sure that it's clear for us we are already at 90% of performance of CGM, AID, insulin pens, type of insulins. So we must be
Oh, yeah, no, 100%. And I think for me, I hope no one takes away from this conversation, oh, you need to do finger pricks during exercise. I'm not saying that. What we're saying is CGM is very accurate, extremely good. If you've just got angled arrows up and angled arrows down, or even double arrows up, it doesn't matter. But if you've got double arrows down and you're heading less than 7, certainly less than 5.5, you would really want to think about doing a finger prick, because in those circumstances, there is a risk already low. Now, if you followed the advice that you're describing before around making sure the insulin on board conditions are reduced, that is unlikely to happen. But if you start activity with full insulin on board, you haven't made any reductions, there is a chance that will be the case. So it's just a small caveat that will be a small percentage of the time, but an important one for people who just look and go, 5.5 hours going down, that's absolutely fine, and carry on. They may go even lower. So in terms of in play, we've said checking before every 30 minutes, 20, 30 minutes. It depends on practicality, obviously.
Exactly. And it depends on the person. So if it must be extremely tight because it's a professional athlete, then they are checking their glucose on the CGM readings around 5 up to 10 minutely. For a normal person living with type 1 diabetes, going 3 times a week for a run, I would recommend 20 up to 30 minutes. And if this person wants to constantly check, then it's also fine. It's totally up to the person, but we must be clear. The more often you check the glucose, the better the glucose is during exercise. This is also shown by evidence.
And in terms of, I guess one watch out for that is the more frequently you check it, thinking about if you're taking carbohydrates on board during, especially like glucose-based, it's going to take 15 to 20 minutes that to get in. So you wouldn't want to be supplementing the carbohydrate more than that, because you might end up then stacking the carbs in. Whereas if you got that 20, 25, 20-minute check, you can then just little drip feed if you need to.
Exactly. So we are still chasing this threshold of 7 millimole per liter. And each time when you see you are below this threshold, consume carbohydrates, a specific amount depending on if you're using AID pen or traditional pump therapy. And we would like to have this treatment extremely early with low amounts of carbs, instead of running on a 3.5 millimole per liter and then eating 3 times 60 gram carbs. And then you have at the end a 20 millimole per liter. So try to intervene as early as possible with small amount of carbs. So when you're below the 126 or 7 millimole per liter, and then you can do in-range exercise, you feel better, I assume. This is what has also been shown through data. It's let me say it very, very Austrian style. You feel like Scheiße when you are running on a 300 milligram per deciliter. So this is what we try to explain. We often do see that the people with type 1 have the hypo threshold at 3.9. And then they are wondering, why there's a hypo during exercise? Then there's the delay in CGM. So treat early, incorporate that there is a lag time of CGM, and then you have in-range exercise.
So if I pull that together from my understanding, to check that I've got this right. Check before, supplement with carbohydrate if you're below 7 or you'll think you're in between 7 and 10 and going to go lower. If you're on an AID system, that's somewhere between 3 and 20 grams, depending on what you're anticipating to happen. If you're on MDI and CSI, it might be a little bit higher, but you could probably follow those guides pretty close, I should imagine.
So, to be honest.
I think you could, So let's just keep it with 1. And then check in every 20 to 30 minutes and repeat. All the way through.
As often as needed. So it could be that there are exercise sessions where you need 1 treatment with carbohydrates, 10 gram carbs, and the next day you do the same procedure again, and it might be 40 gram carbs, 2 times 20. So this is what it is. Even if it's the same type of exercise within the same person, the treatments might be different because the days are different. And this must be clear to the person. The body and the musculature is saying to you, today I need 60 gram carbs per hour, or today I need 5 gram carbs per hour. And when you're running constantly on an 8.3 millimole per liter without any drop or increase in glucose, then you exactly filled in this amount of carbs that the musculature was needing. So you are in this equilibrium.
Now, I've got a tricky one for you here, and this is probably more my personal stance on it than any sort of robust evidence for sure. So you just mentioned all the variability, time of day, how you feel in recovery. But then there's another one that's now thrown in the mix with AID systems. So previously on pens and pump therapy, the amount of basal insulin was always constant. But now these AID systems, depending on what been happening to the glucose in the 2 to 3 hours preceding, it's likely that the person will never go into the exercise with the same insulin conditions, despite doing everything the same, which throws another variable in. And certainly some of the more tuned in people who had really good plans on MDI or pump therapy, they have real problems with consistency. So for them, what we tend to suggest is, how about trying back into manual mode, your general level of basal 2 hours before, run the exercise how you used to do, and then get the benefits of the AID system after. Therefore, you have consistent insulin conditions. It just removes one variable. Now, I'm not suggesting that should be something done by everybody, but if some people really want performance and to stay in that 7 to 10 range, they had mastered that with pens and pump therapy. When they go into AID, it sometimes puts them off because their exercise control goes all over. That is an option. And I know that some people don't go on AID for that reason. We can just go to open loop mode and then get it back on afterwards, if that's the barrier for them.
Maybe I add one example. So we have professional athletes, and for the specific type of sports they are doing, they cannot use an AID system over the day. So what they're doing in the morning at 5 a.m., they're going for a basal insulin pen injection. Throughout the day, they're going for bolus insulin via the pen. And when the last exercise session has been performed, they are using again an AID system for the nighttime period. I know this is not standard operating procedure. This is totally clear to me. But this just, I wanted to say that this is also a solution. There are cases, there are people where AID is not suitable. However, also in professional athletes, but we find solution to do something like a hybrid idea. And you were saying something like a hybrid idea with manual mode and automated mode. Totally fine doing this instead of not using an AID at all.
100%. I mean, the benefits to be gained overnight, it doesn't matter. Like, I like to think with my control during the day, I am a professional. I keep it in target and just a freak on it because that's the way that I want to be. But I can't I can't be like that overnight because you're asleep. And even if you've had the best control or the most in target control during the day, if you've done a bit more exercise, you've had some alcohol, actually having the benefit of having the AID system overnight over a period of a lifetime will save you sleep, get you better glucose control. But if what's putting you off is exercise, there are ways around it. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there because I know there's a lot of people who go, I tried one of those things, and this was me because I cycled to work and back. I had a horrendous time using it, so I just took it away. And then I was like, well, surely I could just do AID overnight and then get back in control during the day. And for me, and then I could use exercise to manage my highs rather than insulin. So getting the best of both worlds. So I think it's just important for people to understand that nuance, because if they're not thinking about an AID or they're having troubles at the moment and they're healthcare professionals trying everything they can with them with strategies and nothing works because it's all due to different insulin conditions, there are other solutions. And you've given some and I've given some there to think about, to speak with your diabetes team.
Absolutely. And it's about finding personalized solution. And I think the numbers are you're spending 3 hours a year with an HCP versus 3,580 hours a year with your own diabetes actively. So you need to find the solution that works for you, and you need to discuss, or you can discuss with your HCP. And I always give the recommendation, find an HCP you can talk to. So this is the most important information, and this person should also listen to you. And it should not be that way that the doctor is only talking to you and explaining random stuff, and you were just thinking, yeah, this was cool 10 years ago. So find an MD or a nurse or whatever, where you have the impression this is your friend, and you can have an open discussion about the problem, and it should be a discussion. Then you can find these solutions, as you were saying, a mixture of manual mode and automatic mode and stuff like that.
Absolutely. So we've covered before, we've covered during, and we're sort of saying that realistically 3 to 20 grams, depending on what's expected to happen during the activity, and trying to stay between that 7 to 10 or 126 to 180.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is kind of what you're doing. So then let's move to after. So you've finished, you've gone all good. What do you need to consider for afterwards, and for how long?
This is a difficult one because we just produced new data, and the new data did show the following. So most people with type 1 diabetes do not have this massive risk of hypoglycemia during exercise. Most of the people has in the first hour after exercise the highest risk of hypoglycemia. And when people are exercising at around 8 up to 10 p.m., there's a second elevation in the risk at around 2 a.m. in the morning. So to sum that up, within the position paper, we were saying something like that. In general, at the end of the exercise session, go back to your regular glucose target. However, if required, then stay on an elevated glucose target. When I do see these data as a general recommendation, to be honest, I would say stay for the following 2 hours after the exercise session on an elevated glucose target or ease off mode or exercise feature or temp target, whatever is it called, just to make sure to avoid post-exercise hypoglycemia. Again, if you're dropping below a certain value you defined for the post-exercise condition, consume carbohydrate, very small amounts depending on the trend error. But I think the major recommendation is stay elevated with the glucose target for up to 2 hours.
So that's if you're on AID, and obviously if you're on pump therapy or MDI and the basal already in there, and you're thinking about a little supplementary carbohydrate just to prop you up.
To be honest, maybe staying with the traditional insulin pump therapy with a reduced basal rate of about 20%. And for the MDI therapy, you don't have all these options. You have the option when you're on the post-exercise condition and they're consuming a huge amount of carbs, then you can go for up to 50% prandial insulin dose reduction. However, also for the insulin pen therapy, fix for yourself a threshold, and when you're below this threshold, support glucose via a small amount of carbs.
Okay. Perfect. So we've got the recommendations there for a little bit of AID, higher target for a bit longer, maybe supplementary carbs. If you're on a standard pump therapy, a slight basal reduction, continue with as you described, and MDI as for them all. If you're having a big meal, a bolus reduction of 25 to 50%, directionally will kind of cover that 1 hour problem. What about this if you're exercising later than, I know it used to be later than 4 p.m., but you're saying later than 8 p.m. Anyway, evening activity. Lasting at least,
Don't exercise so late. Do not do any exercise sessions so late. No, I'm just kidding.
And if you was talking like at least half an hour, it's going to be 20 minutes, I think you said the data. At least 20 minutes. It has to be at least 20 minutes. And then there's a risk potentially of going low overnight. So what are our options therapy based on reducing that risk?
So based on evidence and based on what we do see in the outpatient clinic is proteins is extremely sufficient. So around 1 hour before going to bed, consuming an absolute amount of around 20 gram carbs, maybe not liquids, maybe something like a yogurt or a bar or whatever.
Tuna, boiled eggs, whatever floats your boat.
You like to consume. And this is quite supportive.
Whey protein, a shake? What?
We do not like the shakes so much because we have the impression that the proteins are going via the amino acids too fast into the bloodstream.
But a casein protein would be better than a whey then, because casein's slow digesting. That's my bodybuilding days.
So yes, I do agree, but I could not give this general recommendation now because there's, I think, no evidence where they distinguish between the type of proteins. Or even they did not distinguish
solid food proteins. Okay.
And this is quite helpful.
And am I right in saying that because people think, well, why is protein working? And my understanding, this could be incorrect, is when you eat proteins from obviously a fairly decent biological source, such as meat, chicken, fish, some of the amino acids go to the alpha cell of the pancreas and cause glucagon release, which will then go to the pancreas and help a small bit of glucose be released from the liver overnight. Is that the theory?
Yes, and via the effect of the glyconeogenesis, we have this direct transfer from the proteins into glucose. So via glycogen into glucose could be both. But you have also this glucagon effect where you produce directly also some glucose. At the end of the day, for the person living with type 1 diabetes, you have a slight increase, but not like a peak. It's like you would say, I think, a Gaussian distribution. And this is so supportive in avoiding hypoglycemia.
So potentially better in some ways for a smoother ride than, let's say, the standard biscuit and milk, which is 20 because we push up.
Yeah.
And then if you're on AID system,
Basal
boom,
rate
you're going to go down.
Yeah.
Whereas if you do the protein, you're only going to get a slight elevation. And then also that helps with time in range. And if people are on MDI or standard pump therapy, it's the same.
It's completely the same. And I think what we did also see in our diabetes kids skiing camp was that during the nighttime period, we stayed on the exercise mode. So when they were sleeping, we stayed on the 8.3 mmol per liter.
Is that because you wanted to get sleep yourself?
Yes. I think after the second day, my dear friend Harald, Suri, and myself, we did not sleep at all. And additionally, we were skiing each day over 6 hours. So we were so destroyed. The kids were fully happy because they did not sleep. They didn't wake up with hypos.
But wait, there's two things about that.
Yeah.
Number one, you do your camp skiing for 6 hours. I do mine in the freezing cold, climbing ropes. That's a big difference.
It is.
That's a big difference. But yeah, number two, I totally agree. I've been on enough diabetes camps. 2 nights of no sleep completely wrecks you.
Absolutely.
And you're being pragmatic. So in general, without taking that out of the equation, are the AID systems good enough to prevent hypos and you don't need to put the exercise target on as a start? And then you've got that as a fallback if you do have hypos?
If you do, for example, a 1 hour run in the evening, I think in general, the AID system is capable to stabilize glucose. If you're doing on an everyday basis, 3 hours a day exercise in the evening, and you might need to sleep with an elevated glucose target. So I think this might be an answer.
So the more intense, the longer the duration, the more likely. But in standard that's AID. Pump therapy and MDI, what are our options in this where we know we're going to drop? We've already said protein is one. Any other options?
Reducing the basal, so the manual basal delivery by 20% around-ish. And you can also reduce the ultra-long acting insulins. We did show it in a study with Duchenne and placebo. You can go on the day of exercise for 25% reduction.
Still effective?
And it's active, yeah. So you are halving the time below range with that.
So that's encouraging because I think a lot of clinicians would say, oh, you're on a very long-acting insulin. Actually, reduction is not going to work, but you're saying
that's not true.
Okay.
So we did show it in the ultra-flexi study, which was the largest study for second-generation basal insulin and exercise. So we did 500 exercise sessions with a full dose of placebo or Duchenne reduced, and it was supportive with placebo by halving the amount of hypos. And for the Duchenne, it was quite similar.
Okay. So I'm going to summarize it after that and we'll put this all together. So afterwards, 1 hour afterwards is a high risk. If you're on an AID system, keep the target higher. If you're on standard pump therapy, you could have a basal reduction or a small snack, obviously for MDI. Potentially 25 to 50% bolus reductions for the meal immediately after. Then if the activity has been in the evening, the risk of going low at 2 to 3 o'clock is quite high. AID systems in general will be okay, but if you had prolonged intense, maybe keep it on overnight. For MDI and pump therapy, you're looking at potentially continue the basal reduction of 20% overnight. And then for MDI, potentially the same for the background insulin, but you've also got that additional 20 grams protein that you can throw in there to smooth the ride. But there's also nothing wrong with 20 grams of carbs if you don't get any protein, just to be on the safe side. But be careful if you're on AID, because that might push you high, leading to more insulin. Probably okay in standard pump therapy and MDI, but a little bit more caution with AID.
Always check the insulin on board. If you see that there's a massive increase, then you might have 2 hours afterwards of an increased risk of hypoglycemia.
So I think we've given everyone a really nice, number one, activity is a movement is a timing range, health, amazing tool.
Yeah.
Don't think too much about hypoglycemia, just structure it in your day after eating. That's the most important message.
Yes, absolutely.
Second, we've given a play-by-play tactical based on before, during, and after for the different types of therapies of number one, where to start. Not it will work perfect for you, but somewhere safe to start. But obviously, if you're doing something that's working perfectly, please don't go and think about these, because if it's working perfect, the glucose does never lie. If it's working for you, it's working for you. So I think we've covered a lot of ground. Are there any future directions that you're interested in? You sort of mentioned one about thinking about CGM and AID with a bit more exercise specific support. Where do you see the future going with that? What are you involved in that you're excited about?
So we are involved or in the early stage of a very novel insulin. We would like to incorporate within an AID system. So the onset of the blood glucose lowering effect is around after 10 minutes, and it's out around 90 minutes afterwards. This would be a perfect insulin to be incorporated within an AID system. I do not say the name of the company.
Okay.
But
You heard it here first.
We performed already a study in cards for type 2s and also one pivotal study for type 1s. But
and injected, not nasal?
Injected.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, it was via double-blinded setting. And
okay, nice.
Because of insulin pen injected, So this is what we would like to chase, but there's so many interests involved, and I do only have one interest in bring this insulin into an AID, because then it's not called hybrid closed loop, it would be called fully closed loop. So then you don't need to announce exercise or the meals. Secondly, I think there's also a company already existing with glucagon involved. This fully closed loop will be available in the Netherlands with 2026. It's already approved. The studies did show the time in range over 1 year without the option of doing it. There's just a black display on it, was 80%.
Wow.
Time below range was 1.4. So really promising data. So I think, to sum that up, the future is quite promising. We are working especially to try our best to incorporate a very fast-acting insulin into a fully closed-loop device, which is also in development at the moment. We just received yesterday the information that our study idea was approved with a different fully closed-loop system. And I think there are so many groups, so many companies also working on this idea. I think we can clearly say we did see yesterday with Ypsomed the first version of the patch pump, which looked great. So I think the companies are following the idea of a patch pump.
Yes.
And they are following the idea of fully closed loop. And some companies are following the idea of incorporating glucagon as a counter-regulatory hormone to avoid hypoglycemia.
I mean, that's amazing to hear, because that's something that is one of my bugbears with managing diabetes myself, is just how slow insulin is. And if we're thinking there may be on the horizon an insulin which is almost doubly as fast or as effective, that is kind of really encouraging. And it's great that you're involved in all that, because I can ask some questions, which is great in the future. So as we wrap up, I'm just going to ask you some questions for the audience. So the first one was, obviously we talked about the benefits of activity in general, but I wanted to kind of have a think about, is the benefit of activity of equal type 1 for cardiovascular improvements? Is it just to do with the musculature that you develop, or is there something about insulin dose changes and things that actually has an extra benefit for people with type 1?
I think the major benefit is the cardiovascular effect, because when we do see that the person with type 1 diabetes is chronically deteriorating with his health status, then it's always a cardiovascular issue, always. So this is why I was saying at the beginning, you do see also this immediate positive effect on glucose. But to be honest, again, I prefer an HbA1c of around, am I allowed to say that, 8%?
Yeah.
And if someone is exercising every day instead of having an HbA of 6%. So I do expect that these data are still missing, that you have this very positive effects of exercise, which can overcome the negative effects of an elevated HbA1c. We still try to work on collecting these data. Could be easily collected, to be honest. When you have long-term data over 10 years of type 1s, they're using a physical activity tracker, and you have over this period of time at least half yearly one HbA1c. These days we have the CGM data, and then you could show the best way would be low HbA1c and regular exercise, and worst situation is extremely elevated HbA1c and no exercise.
I think that's a really point. It's just a kind of just occurred to me and struck me there, is it might actually be worth sacrificing a slightly lower timing range and slightly higher HbA1c, because the data for the increased activity, people outside diabetes as well, the data is there. As activity goes up, all-cause mortality drops down.
Absolutely.
As exercise goes up, cardiovascular mortality drops right off. You don't see that strength with glucose changes.
No.
The strength of the activity data is stronger than differences in HbA1c in the population. So I think such a key point, because people are, it might mess my glucose control up. Well, if you lose 5 to 10% of time in range, but you're being active more than the recommended amount, you're actually going to reap more benefit. It's about majoring in the majors and not necessarily being so obsessive about glucose control.
No.
But you can't do both. You can't sit on your backside and have high glucose control. You've got to do one or the other.
Be obsessed in reaching 10,000 steps a day or whatever, what your personal target is, not just your personal glucose target, your personal steps and physical activity target. And if you reach both an HbA1c below 7% and a time range of 70% as the minimum recommendation, and receiving at the same time the WHO recommendations, I think then you are the perfect type 1.
Exactly. Just a quick one, because you're obviously quite. Do you use the Ipso pump and the CAM APS yourself, or do you use something different? Are you happy to say, or do you know what not to say?
So I can, absolutely, I can say what I'm using at the moment. At the moment, I'm running on CAM APS, but I'm mainly running on that devices we are testing in studies.
Okay.
So in the last year, I used 5 different pumps. I think I used 4 different insulins within the pumps, 4 specific research questions to develop study protocols and study ideas. So I'm
a fellow man of trying things out here. So I'm with you.
I'm fully open, but all the AID systems has advantages and disadvantages.
I mean, that's amazing to hear. One of the questions a hiker had, which is Peter, he said, does a lot of walking, and he noticed that basically there's only like 10% of basal delivery during his massive hike. Is that a problem, or going to cause a problem with DKA?
Okay, good one.
Sorry, he's hiking for several hours.
Yeah.
He checked his CAM APS, or it could be any AID system. Obviously, ease off, suspended insulin delivery, very little amounts of basal going in, only 10%.
Yeah.
No ketones, but is that a problem?
No, if ketones are fine and we accept ketones that are below 1.5 millimole per liter, we did see a couple of days ago, a type 1 was running the Transalp, so it's 7 days in the mountains, running for 6 hours, and the ketones were constantly at 1.3, 1.4, 1.5. Even he had around 30 units of insulin in the body. So it's normal, and it's not a ketoacidosis, it's a ketosis. So these are 2 different things. So focus on the symptoms. As soon as you feel sick, then it's an issue.
Perfect. Another hiking question. This is someone who's on an ultra long.
The main of the question from the UK. You can't hike. I was living in Swansea for 3 years. You can't hike. There is a beach. There are some, I would call it hills. But in Austria, we have the real mountains. Just wanted to.
So, and actually, to say that. On that note, I've had to collect the questions. So I put out some promotion before about different episodes we've got coming up. And a few people, they got some questions and they got a few impressions on LinkedIn. Yeah. Yours was off the chart. I mean, literally thousands of impressions, loads of questions. You're either obviously a popular man because you know your stuff, or it might be because you're a good looking bloke, but who knows? But either way, you're a popular man. It was just a question of around, they're on Tracebo, they're doing hiking, massive problems with hypos, and I think we've sort of answered the questions we've gone along. So my impression would be from what you've said is, number one, you can reduce the Tracebo and it's going to be 25%. You've got all the strategies we discussed, at least 50%, maybe 75% reductions in bolus insulin. And then every 20 minutes, top up with carbohydrate. Be very mindful of that night when you've hiked, then either have the protein, do the carbs. So I think we've answered those questions that we've gone along.
Maybe one sentence to add, and also try maybe to consume proteins during the hiking. That's further supportive of avoiding hyper.
And are you a fan of, have you ever heard of, during these hikes, if you're really struggling, you could do a sprint to give some
Yes. Yeah. You have this catecholamine effect, stress hormones go up, and hepatic glycogen depletion starts to increase glucose.
And I think you've answered this question. This came in really nicely. There's a mum, Rachel, and her young daughter is a dancer, high-level dancer. And they're having issues with glucose control, as they do, when they do so much intense stuff. And she's basically saying, should I be worried about the blood glucose fluctuations? If the overall HbA1c is okay, of fluctuations. But I think from what you've said is, if this high-level dancer is doing so much physical activity and the overall HbA1c and time range is reasonable, that bit of variability is not going to trump the amazing things that all that dancing is doing for that young lady.
Do agree, yes. Yeah. So if my son would have type 1 diabetes and he's doing everyday exercise and HbA1c is okay-ish, I'm totally fine. I'm totally fine with it.
I think that is a perfect note to end on, because I think there's a lot of people listening to this. We're so glucose centric as a type 1 space, because that's what we get measured on. You go back, you get HbA1c checked, now you get timing range checked, and it's all like online, who's got 90% timing range. No one's saying, how fit are you? How much activity are you doing? What's your activity range like? I actually think it's such a nice thing to pull back to say, glucose is one thing, but your overall health encompasses so much, and activity and exercise gives you so much of it. It's time to really push that narrative and discussion.
Maybe one sentence from the outpatient clinic. So we have the specialized outpatient clinic for physical activity and exercise and diabetes. And from my experience, I do see also very old type 1s. So they are aged above 80. And all of them that are doing well were the ones that were their entire life physically active. And additionally, they did regular exercise even at the age of 80. And think about it, 50 years, 60 years ago, what it meant having type 1 diabetes. The prognostic value was you're dead within 10 years. And these type 1s who are really old are still physically active. So from an experience point of view, and not evidence-based, just my experience, my impression, it's this multipotent effect of exercise that brings you to an age with type 1 diabetes that is extremely old, but you're still healthy. You're there in the brain where you want to be, and you're fully focused on that, what you're doing. And this was so interesting seeing this. So I have at the moment, I think 7 people that are aged above 80 with type 1 in the specialized outpatient clinic for exercise. And they're explaining so often to me what works for them and what not. And we are using some of their recommendations in developing study protocols. And all of them are using an AID, by the way, at the age of 80.
Amazing. Well, I just want to say, first of all, thank you on many levels. Thank you personally for helping me on my journey to be involved with some of the guidelines. Thank you for all the work that you do for people with type 1, both as you've just described previously, but also you can hear the passion and where you're heading towards in the future. And just also thank you for pushing the message of there is glucose control, but there's also being physically active, and the benefits are both there to be gained, but don't sacrifice the nth degree of glucose control and for when you could have been more active, because as you just described there with the older generation of type 1s, they're the physically active ones. So that's the message I think is perfect to leave on. So I just want to thank you for your time. I hope you have a beautiful EASD, and I'm sure we'll definitely have to do a round 2 where we delve into kind of what's new. But yeah, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you so much.